Blog Talk Radio. Hello, Subversive Radio listeners, and welcome to a very exciting issue of, or episode, I should say, of our Subversive Radio podcast. I am very blessed because we are going to be going into a topic that typically when I've done interviews in this series, I've interviewed people that are really great friends of mine. Most of them I've known for quite a long time, and we agree on nearly everything that we discuss. This evening, I'm going to bring on a man named Al Baker, who up until a few seconds ago, before the music started, I had never spoken to on the phone before or even met in person. We've only had an online conversation for several months, and he and I don't agree on the topic that we're going to discuss. So I know automatically before we even begin, we're in for a treat. Our topic this podcast is what's so great about Constantine. And the way Al and I met each other, to make a long story short, was he found an article that I had written on my blog where I made a comment about Constantine and his influence on the Christian church, specifically in regards to violence in the Christian church, and took issue at some of the scholarship of the quote. And what then transpired was a long back and forth, very cordial back and forth conversation about the authenticity of that quote, and as well as other things as we got into the whole topic of Constantine and his influence on the early church. And it was such a wonderful conversation we had back and forth for such a long time that I thought, it would be really wonderful to have him come on Subversive Radio and join me, and let's just kind of have this same conversation in front of everybody else here. So Dr. Baker is he was on the faculty of St. Augustine's University in Raleigh, North Carolina for about 6 years, served as the interim chair of the Philosophy and Religion Department in his final year. He's taught church history and intro to philosophy and various other religious studies classes. And in 2005, he started writing and publishing a website called Church History 101. And that's where he continues to publish. He's written several papers that are used in church history classes around the United States on various topics. And so therefore, just from the introduction, this guy knows a whole lot more about this topic than I do. And so we'll see where this is going to go. Al, welcome to Subversive Radio.
Hey, Keith, thank you for having me. I was really excited to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, and I do want to thank you, too, just even for being patient with me. I know we went back and forth for several months on this topic, and you were patient with me to go back and do some research. And I want to thank you also specifically just for keeping me honest, because quite often if I say something or blog something, it's great to have someone to call me and say, hey, wait a minute, why do you know that, or where did you get that from, or can you verify those quotes? And so I actually appreciate that. I appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Well, you're quite welcome. People do that to me every week, and that's part of. To be honest with you, it's one of the things that I think is lacking in the U.S. Academic arena. I did my Ph.D. in Scotland, and I will tell you that in the United Kingdom, they're much more rigorous about holding your feet to the fire. And in the U.S., I find scholars can, once they are tenured, they can say anything they want to say, and it doesn't matter what their background, it doesn't matter what their context is, or they don't produce, for example, primary documentation, whatever.
Right.
And I've been corrected on my website 2 or 3 times and was embarrassed when someone pointed out something I'd said that wasn't correct, but I usually acknowledge it, give credit, and I leave it on there that I was corrected. I think that's important. I think it's a humility factor that a lot of people in academics, unfortunately, somewhere along the line they lose that, if they ever have it. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I appreciate that, Al. Thank you. And I want to be someone who's correctable by you or anyone else as well. So I appreciate that. Hey, so before we kind of dive into the meat of our topic, I know from our conversation before we started the show, you had made a comment about why this topic is so important to you. This whole idea of this, Constantine and his influence on the church, the early church, as well as the modern church. And so, why don't you go on and tell us why does this mean so much to you?
Okay. I'm going to try to keep my comments as brief as possible because I want to hear your responses. If we have any callers, I want to give them a chance. So I'm going to work real hard at something I'm not good at, and that's being brief.
Okay.
I grew up in a scientific home. My father was a NASA engineer and was not a Christian. I didn't grow up in a Christian environment. I grew up in a Christian environment, but not Christian parents, if that makes any sense. They had good morals and ethics. We went to church, but it was not Christian.
Right. So more church attendance.
I'm sorry?
More attending church, but not necessarily living it out as much.
Well, we attended a liberal United Methodist church. It was very liturgical, and quite frankly, I don't ever remember hearing the message of the gospel growing up.
Wow.
Having said that, I only mention that because I was brought up in a very scientific-oriented home where I was taught to question everything, challenge authority, anything that was said to me. So that's just the way I was brought up. Right. I had a dramatic salvation experience at the age of 17, and I immediately found myself in, of course I didn't know it then, but now I know it, I found myself in a charismatic, fairly fundamentalist organizational structure or, expression of Christianity. And I stayed in that for about 6 years. And I was a very, I was a very devoted, I like to tell my students I was the holiest Christian that I knew, which is unfortunate, but that is honestly what I thought. And I was not even smart enough to realize that even thinking that was sinful, but nonetheless. But I was in an Anabaptist free church orientation, so a lot of what I learned about Constantine, I heard at church. I heard from preachers. In fact, most of what I learned from preachers because in the good Anabaptist model, I typically didn't read anything outside the Scriptures. And I read the Scriptures, Genesis to Revelation, 10 or 12 times. I used to keep track of it, and I knew the Scriptures backwards and forwards, but I never read anything outside that. And so for me it's important because when I started learning and growing as a pastor later on in my pilgrimage and having to study to do a good job of teaching university students, I was a university pastor, and so I was teaching young men and women who were smarter than me, sharper than me, and I knew I needed to be good, and so I did a lot more studying, and as I read and studied, I started seeing things that really contradicted what I'd been taught as a young man. And the more I learned, the more I found. I learned things that were not correct. Historically, biblically, philosophically, every which way. And, I like to tell my students when I was a young man, I was told over and over again, because I asked questions when things didn't make sense. And I cannot tell you how many times I was told, Al, you're thinking too much and that's dangerous. Just believe what we're telling you. We're giving you good, solid doctrine. You believe this. Don't read these other writings. That'll get you in trouble. And you need to stop trying to think too much because that'll get you in trouble. Well, when I eventually went to do my Ph.D. work and started reading the ancient writings, you can imagine how it irritated me when I found out the two strongest critics of early Christianity in the 2nd century, Galen the physician, Celsus the philosopher, and both of them accused Christianity of being a stupid man's religion. And I think if I quote one of them correctly, they said something like, "You teach your people, only believe, do not question, only believe." And that really annoyed me because that's what I was taught as a young man. Mm-hmm. So for me, a lot of what I run into about Constantine now frustrates me because it is exactly what I used to believe, and it's built on fabricated history, and that's why it's important to me. It's kind of like in my introductory email to you many, many months ago, and I've done this to numerous other people, so I don't want you to think I picked on you.
You didn't single me out.
I remember one time asking you, I bet you wonder why is this guy taking the time to email me, thinking I must be a crazy man. But to me, it never promotes God's agenda for us to misrepresent facts or data. It just doesn't do God any good to misrepresent truth. Truth is truth. I mean, if we think it comes against our doctrinal views, then we need to be patient enough to say, okay, I feel like this data is conflicting with what I believe, so I need to figure out if what I believe needs to be modified, or do I need to dig and make sure that I'm understanding the data correctly? And I just don't think we do that enough. We just glibly follow what the preacher told us, and we believe it. And unfortunately, that's kind of why it's so important to me, Keith.
No, and I completely understand, and I agree with you, Al. And I have similar frustrations, probably not about the same things, but I very often run into Christians online as well as in the real world, who, when I quote something, I'll tell them something or quote something from the New Testament, and they look at me like I made that up, because they really don't know, that's from Scripture. And so I run into that quite often, and I have frustrations as well that people are, and I think people even listening to me or my podcast or my blog run the same risk of saying, well, rather than read the Bible for myself, I'll just see what Keith thinks about that. And that's a dangerous thing. I think that's a bad idea. Nobody should ever do that.
I brought my children up to question me. I told them if I do my job as a parent, when you get older, you're going to start challenging me. And I've apparently was successful because my daughters love to challenge me now.
Yeah. And you know what? And I've done the same thing. I've done the same thing with I have two teenage boys. One of them going to turn 19. Starting college. He actually just started going to Cal State Fullerton to college this week. And from a young age, I taught them to think critically. Even to not take everything I said at face value, but to think about it and question it, because I think that's a healthy thing.
Well, and if I could just insert one last thing. I'm oftentimes asked, why did I get interested in early Christianity, early church history? Mm-hmm. As a very young Christian, a guy in my liberal Methodist church got in my face one day and started telling me all the things that liberal, commentators, biblical scholars, and whatever, the ones on the more liberal end are still propagating today. And his basic comment was the Bible isn't the same Bible that they had back in the day of, early church. And I went to the library and started looking up early church writers and reading Tertullian, reading Justin Martyr, reading Irenaeus. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have to read very long before I started thinking, wait a minute. These guys, when they quote the biblical text, it's the same. It's virtually the same as what I read.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, but
in fact, you know what, Al? In fact, you know what? To that point, just real quick, I'll let you finish. But to that point, I think I had heard that even if we had lost all of the manuscripts that we had of the New Testament, we could actually still reconstruct the complete New Testament if we still had the writings of the early church fathers, because they quoted the New Testament so much that we could actually just take their quotes and rebuild most of the New Testament anyway.
Absolutely. But you're going to love this, Keith, since you and I haven't had enough time to talk personally.
Okay.
Part of the reason I wanted to study early Christianity is because, as a good Anabaptist free church person, I'd read David Berceau's Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up, and I believed everything he told me in that book. You can read my review of him now. I'm highly critical of him. I don't think he does a very good job at all of presenting early Christianity. But I wanted to find out what was so big about the second century church that in my view was so good and so following, the teachings of Christ so diligently. And I wanted to know what it was about them. If we can rediscover what they had, then maybe we can replicate it today. And Keith, what I realized as I started reading early church history is they didn't get it right either. None of us have ever gotten it right. I personally don't think we'll ever get it right. I think God's purpose is that we not get it right, because getting it right is not about doctrine. It's not about dogma. It's about how we love each other and treat others around us. But so the more I read about early Christianity, the more I realized, oh my gosh, number one, a lot that I was told simply wasn't true. But number two, a lot of my views of what I thought were the perfect early second century, third century church is not true either. So anyway, let me drop it right there so we can get on to Constantine.
Sure, let's do it. And you know what? And before we get into it, just in case anyone is listening live by some miracle and decides they would like to call in, the number is 646-652-4945, and you're welcome to call in if you want to ask me or Al anything about Constantine, early church, that kind of thing. Ask us to clarify something. We have a question, something you've always wanted to know about early church history. We'll do our best to answer that question. And all right, so I had sent you some questions ahead of time, and one of those, I think just wanted to start this off, would be to say, when we're talking about Constantine, and as you've already alluded to, many people, and I include myself in that group, many people see Constantine as having a very negative impact on the Christian church today. And they lay at his feet the blame for a lot of things, like the rise of Christian nationalism, a very pro-military or pro-violent form of Christianity, the idea of hierarchy in the church, of there being a clergy class versus a congregational class of Christian, etc. And so do you feel like, before we get into the specifics of some of the other things we're going to talk about, do you feel like any of those accusations are accurate about Constantine?
Here's my feeling about that question, Keith, is that those are such general statements that I think it's real difficult to defend that position, and it's very difficult to argue against it either, because those are so broad, those are so general. I mean, let me just give you one example: nationalism. I'm assuming that you are, because of the other questions you sent me, and because I grew up as a young Christian man in the Free Church Anabaptist movement, and I'm assuming that by nationalism you are referring to, for example, the religious right in America that is seems to be so aligned with patriotism and flying the flag and the military and it could also be the Republican Party and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it could also be expressed in the form of Zionism.
America's the greatest.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and I think, to me, nationalism has always existed. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they all thought their culture was the greatest culture that had ever existed.
Oh yeah. No, but what I mean though, Al, is, I'm not saying that Constantine invented nationalism as a concept. I just mean that seeping into the church is something that was facilitated by, for example, Constantine declaring Christianity as a state religion and putting the clergy on the payroll and elevating them to the level of the senators within the Roman government and that kind of a thing. And so those specific things that he did, I believe, helped to create within the church the idea of, if I'm a Christian in Italy, well, then anything Italy is doing, God is doing, and, if I have to, God bless Italy, and if I have to kill someone to protect Italy's interest, well, then that's okay with God.
Well, first of all, Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion. That came after he died, and that's one of the myths about him that is perpetrated by Anabaptist Free Church people, and it's just not true.
But didn't he?
Go ahead.
I was going to say no, and again, I bow to your scholarship in this area. I would just ask. You're saying he didn't make it the official religion, but the things that he did during his reign made that possible. In other words, without Constantine, that would have never happened. Absolutely
true. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. In fact, that would be one of my, I love how you named this interview or podcast, What's So Great About Constantine, a play on Constantine the Great. And and I decided several days ago, when I saw your title, to start naming the reasons why Constantine was named the Great. Well, first of all, he named himself the Great, which all Roman emperors did when they won a decisive battle. They referred to themselves as Maximus, the Great, the greatest. Mm-hmm. But yes, and one of the reasons that he is viewed as Constantine the Great is because under Constantine, Christianity no longer was persecuted, had their buildings destroyed or taken from them, or burned at the stake, or thrown in prison, or had their eyes gouged out and their tongues cut out. So it was because of Constantine that the Roman Empire stopped persecuting Christians. And that's one of the reasons he was always considered great, was religious tolerance. Now, did he keep the religious tolerance for his entire life? No. He had points in his life where he tried to strong-arm Christianity on the general public. But every time he did it, he had a backlash, and he listened to those critics and backed away. Now, did he show favor to Christianity? Yes. And was it because of his entire 31 years of being an emperor, a ruler? Now, we also need to recognize that only the last dozen years of his rule was he the sole, the senior Caesar Augustus. The other 19 years, or am I right? 19 and 12 is that 31? Yeah, I'm not a mathematician. The other 19 years, he shared his emperorship, if you will, with other men, and was like the Roman, like before him, was involved in civil wars to see who would, Roman emperors fighting for supremacy. Right. That's another reason he's considered great, is that with Constantine, that came to an end. The constant civil war of men who are supposed to be Caesars ruling together, fighting each other, came to an end under Constantine. Now, some of the way it came to an end is he defeated two men decisively on his way to become the sole ruler. But, for example, the final man that he was sharing, it was a tetrarchy established by Diocletian, where one man was the Augustus on the west and Augustus in the east, and each man, so he was like the president of the West and the president of the East, and under each of them was a Caesar, kind of like the vice president.
Right.
Diocletian set that up. It was a disaster. Constantine's father was the first Caesar under Diocletian, and he was the Caesar of the West. The last man that Constantine defeated in battle was Licinius, who was the Augustus, the president of the East. Constantine was the Augustus of the West, and they had to have a decisive battle. One of the things that brought them to that was that Licinius started persecuting Christians again, started destroying Christian churches and putting them in prison and killing them. And Constantine just basically said, you know what, forget this. God put his hand on me to put a stop to this, and so he defeated Licinius, became the sole ruler. But so that's a long answer to say, do I think Constantine's actions encouraged, some kind of nationalism? Certainly it did. He had an influence in all the things you mentioned. Yes, he had some influence in Christianity being pro-military. Yes, he had some influence in Christianity's hierarchical leadership model, but he didn't cause any of it. All of that was in existence before he came into power. And that's the thing that concerns me, is when we try to blame everything on Constantine, we're not understanding that Christianity had, if you think those are problems, Christianity had those problems before Constantine.
No, and I agree, yes. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
He may have made them worse, but here's what I would say. Here's what I would say. We have to be very careful as 21st century American, Western-oriented Christians when we judge other cultures, especially when we judge other cultures in other epochs, other eras of history. Because we tend to impose on other cultures and other ages the same sensibilities that we have right now in modern Western culture, America, and that's not fair. And we judge other men in the past by things that we hold true right now. The way I illustrate that, if I may, real quickly, and
please.
I'm going to stop.
I was going to ask you to do that. I was going to ask you to do that anyway. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you to clarify that anyway, because it's a little that statement is a little strange to me. So please clarify it.
Yeah, and these two examples I think will help you understand. This is what I used to do in my church history class. On the first day of the lecture, I would tell them these two stories, or this one story, to try to prepare them to reserve judgment, because most of my students were in Anabaptist background. They were Baptists. They were, they were free church oriented, and I was trying to prepare them, don't judge these early Christians too quickly, okay? And here's my example. When I was a young kid, I was probably 8 years old. I remember this. I came home, my dad, it was on a Saturday, my hand was bleeding, I was crying, and I told my dad, my dad goes, "What's wrong?" And by the way, my dad didn't jump out of his chair and think the world was coming to an end because his son was crying and his hand was bleeding. And, even that is different now. When our child is injured, we jump up and it's like a 9-alarm fire.
Right.
My dad says, "What's wrong?" And I said, "The dog down the street bit me." The first words out of his mouth, "What did you do to the dog to make him bite you?" And he wasn't playing around. He was serious. Now, I didn't have to have stitches. It wasn't terrible. But the point is, if a child gets bit by a dog now, oh my gosh, we're going to go down there. We might sue them. We want the dog to be impounded. A lot of people are going to want the dog to be put down. We don't want the dog to be loose. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, little Johnny got bit by a dog and the world has come to a screeching halt.
Right.
And that's one example of our sensibilities today that is just real clear to me, that we've got to be careful. Just recently, there was a botched execution in Ohio.
Right.
And, it made big news. And now, whether you believe in capital punishment or not, that's not the point of my story. The point of my story is this. There were so many people that had just a crazy knee-jerk reaction. Oh, my gosh, it took this man 20 minutes to die. Oh, my gosh, our constitutional rights are being violated. The death penalty is terrible. In our Constitution, it talks about that we shall not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. Well, let me tell you, the Founding Fathers, they had it fresh on their mind, the guillotine in France and impalements. Right. They impaled people in Europe into the 18th century. Impalement, where it could take you 3 days hanging on a stake before you died. And they did it in the middle of the public square. That's
right.
what the Founding Fathers were thinking about. If we were to tell them that, injecting a man with drugs in his veins to make him go to sleep forever was cruel and unusual punishment, the Founding Fathers would think that we lost our mind. And
right.
that's just two examples of how our 21st sensibilities are so different, radically different from even like my dad and the dog bite 45 years ago. I'm 55, so 45 years ago. So I just think we have to be careful when we start looking at ancient cultures and when we look at other cultures and what they do.
Right. And I agree with you, but I think two things. One, I think the first thing I'd say is I think it's difficult for us. I mean, what other context can I look at something in except my own frame of reference? I mean, I can't help that I have a frame of reference and that when I read something, whether it happened yesterday or it happened 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or it happened in this culture or another culture, I am going to, they're saying I can't help but react based on my own personal framework and parameters. And then the second thing is I think I agree with you that we need to be aware of those differences. I mean, we need to understand that that's a different culture, that was a different time, and so I need to be aware of the fact that something that might strike my mind as being cruel or foolish or evil or whatever, maybe in that culture and in that time frame, within the way the world was back then, it wasn't. So I think being aware of it is helpful, but I don't think I can help but learn things and say, that's wrong, because to me that is still wrong. It's wrong because it's wrong. It's not wrong because, it's wrong in America today, but it wasn't wrong then. And so, but now that we've said that, what is it that can you think of a specific thing that you feel like people do to Constantine? And as an example, like, in what way are we looking at, like someone like me looks at Constantine and then judges him using from the wrong framework or the wrong set of parameters? Do you have a specific example of that? Well,
and this could get us straight to one of our, the very thing that we talked about right off the bat.
And that's great.
The Donatist.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
And if I could, I will give a very quick history of what happened, okay?
Yeah, please do.
All right. During the Diocletian persecution, which was started around 303, okay? Constantine was a general under Diocletian. Diocletian and his co-emperor Galerius, for various reasons, decided Christianity was a bad thing for the Roman Empire, and they started a violent persecution against the Christians. Now, realize, and this is another important thing, Roman persecution didn't happen every day, every year, every decade. Roman persecution kind of came in ebbs and flows. Mm-hmm. Not every Roman emperor did persecuted people. Like, even during the Diocletian persecution, which the early church called the Great Persecution, Constantine's father refused to do it. He was in the West, and he refused to do it because he just didn't think it was a good idea. He didn't think it was good politics. He didn't think it was humane. He probably, as a good Roman citizen, felt like it wasn't right to persecute our fellow citizens for their religious beliefs. He wasn't a Christian, but he was hailed by the early Christians as a good emperor because he never persecuted. But so Roman persecution didn't happen all the time. There was an ebb and a flow. But the Diocletian persecution was particularly fierce. During that time, as was very common in all the major persecution, you had Christians that, what would happen is churches would disband. And let me just mention this real quick because it's an interesting part of the dynamic that I know you and that you hold to, Keith.
Yeah.
The Diocletian persecution started by the destruction of the church building in Nicomedia. Galerius and Diocletian stood on their balcony and watched while Roman soldiers demolished a big church in Nicomedia. It was, they described it like a cathedral, but it wasn't a cathedral because cathedrals didn't come for centuries. But the point was, it was a large edifice, and Diocletian and Galerius watched and laughed as the Romans went in there and tore it to the ground and set it on fire and took the communion, vessels made of gold and stuff and handed them to people in the streets. Just, brazen disregard for the whole thing. Well, anyway, during times like that, Christians would go into hiding. The Romans, probably in the 2nd century, had decided the way to stop the spread of Christianity is to attack the bishops. If we attack the leaders, then the other Christians will stop following. Well, indeed, what happened was they drove the Christians underground. They didn't realize that. The Christians kept meeting. They just didn't meet in their same place. But a lot of Christians during those times would quit coming to church. They would fall away. They would start sinning. And they called them lapsed. They were lapsed believers. Well, when the persecution ended, then the bishops, would spread the word of mouth in their community. Hey, we're going to meet again. We're going to meet at so-and-so's home, or we're going to meet at such and such a location, on Sunday morning to resume our meetings. And so there were stories of bishops walking down to their church building or house, wherever they were meeting, turning the corner and seeing a mass of people standing in front of where they were going to have church because they were not let in because they were known to have lapsed. And the early church, the early Christians wouldn't let them in the building until the bishop granted them forgiveness or made sure they were repentant. And so in North Africa, while the persecution was going on, there was a conflict because the guy who was one of the bishops there had been ordained by another bishop who had handed over documents to the Romans. Oftentimes the Romans, for a bishop, they would say, look, if you'll hand us your scriptures to be burned, we'll let you go. We won't we won't torment you, we won't torture you, we won't throw you in prison. And so one of these bishops handed over some documents, and we don't know, but the report was that they were probably medical journals. They weren't even scriptures. The Roman soldiers, most of them couldn't read Latin or Greek, but they certainly wouldn't be able to read Greek, the average Roman soldier. Only 5% of the population could read anyway. And if you handed them a document in Greek, the Roman soldiers assumed that it was the scriptures. And so but you know what? In North Africa, they had a very, very strict view of what you should and shouldn't do. And so a man named Donatus started going around and ordaining people to be pastors and bishops because he disagreed with the man who had been ordained to be the bishop in his area. Well, while he was doing it initially, the bishop was in prison as a martyr, but Donatus didn't agree with the position that the bishop had taken anyway. And so he went around ordaining men to be, ordaining men, and they were basically taking over the existing churches by Donatus ordaining them. And the Donatus believed that if you lapsed during persecution, that the only way to be saved is to be rebaptized and kind of be saved again.
Right.
Most of us who were brought up in a Baptist or an Anabaptist tradition, we joke around about how many times you rededicate. How many times did you get saved? Because every time you backslid, you were made to feel like you weren't saved and you had to get saved all over again. Well, that's what the Donatists were teaching. And the Orthodox Church had already determined in the middle of the 3rd century, 60 years prior, the church had said, look, when you lapse, you don't have to be baptized again. In fact, it's wrong to be baptized a second time because that's basically saying the first baptism didn't mean anything. And so there was great conflict over this issue of whether you should be baptized or not again. So, all right, we speed forward a little bit into a little bit of time. Several years later, when Constantine has his vision and he proclaims that he has become a Christian, he found out about the Donatist situation. He was told about it. He had heard references to it earlier on a tour. He had heard pagans making fun of. Actually, never mind. I'm getting that mixed up with the later controversy with the Arians. But nonetheless, Constantine told the bishop in Rome, look, would you go deal with this issue in North Africa and straighten it out? And they went through several attempts to get Donatus to stop doing it, what he was doing, and he refused. And all the people behind him refused. And so it became such a big deal that at one point the Donatists went in by force and took several churches, especially in was it Carthage or Numidia? I can't remember the city.
I think it was Carthage.
I think it was Carthage. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think it's Carthage, yeah.
Yeah, and they took over churches by force. And this was after 2 or 3 church councils had ruled against Donatus. And so at some point, Constantine said, look, I want these guys out of these churches. They're not supposed to be in there. The bishops ruled against him. And he told his governor, the governor in North Africa, just a Roman governor, he told him, don't let violence in the streets happen. In fact, to be honest with you, that was what I was trying to remember. Prior to him ever hearing about the Donatist crisis, he had heard that there was violent protests in the streets, and he warned his governor that he didn't want to have violence in the streets and he better do something about it. And that leads me to another point. North Africa was a volatile place. It was a volatile place from years before that as a result of the Third Punic War, when Rome utterly destroyed Carthage and absolutely leveled it to the ground and let it sit desolate for several years and then repopulated it. And so the Carthaginians and the Numidians had a dislike for Rome. They had a dislike for anything that had to do with Rome. I mean, it kind of like I grew up in Alabama, and I can tell you to this day, if you're around people like me who were raised in the South, if you mention General Sherman and his march through the South at the end of the Civil War, you're going to get people like me feeling irritated, because I grew up hearing about my forefathers having to hide their valuables and bury them in the dirt because the Union soldiers were coming through and basically taking anything of value that anybody had. So, there's deep-seated anger in North Africa towards Rome. Well, what happens is the Donatists start protesting in the streets. They had a group that was really rowdy, and they're a little subset of Donatism. And so Constantine had told the governor, do something about it. Well, the Christian bishop went to the governor and said, look, Constantine told me that we can have these churches back. I want them back. And because of all that was happening, the governor sent in Roman troops demanding the Donatists to get out of the churches. And in one particular church, the Donatists basically refused and went to blows against the Roman soldiers. They started fighting the Roman soldiers, and the Romans massacred. Well, I say massacred. That's the word that was used. I mean, probably between half a dozen to 18 people died in the church. Donatist people died in the church at the hands of Roman soldiers. Right. And, and that was the reference to that I took objection to, that Constantine led an army of Christians against other Christians. Because number one, Constantine did not lead an army. It was a police force. I don't know how many soldiers it was, but I can assure you it was not an army. It was it was probably, I would guess, I mean, I don't know the designation of the Roman forces, but I'm going to guess it was a small battalion of maybe 24 to 36 men. And it was only in that one city. It was only in Carthage, and the deaths, I think, were only in one church. In fact, the Numidian Donatist churches were no one ever bothered them. Eventually, Constantine told the Donatists, he told the governor, just leave him alone. He came to realize that was a mistake, and he regretted it fairly quickly. And so he ended up saying, look, he kept making efforts to get the Donatists on board, and they just never would. And so what he ended up doing is he ended up letting them have the churches they took over, and he built
new ones. Yeah, he just built new ones for the other guys. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so the quote that quoting me, it said that Constantine, for the first time, led an army of Christians against Christians, and this was the first time that this had happened. And so your question to me, by the time you saw that article, I had written it so long ago. Before that, I was sort of like, gosh, where did I get that quote from? And so you kind of forced me to go back and redig again, which I did, and that was kind of a little bit of the back and forth. So while I was looking for, where did that quote come from, we continued to talk about Constantine and those kind of things. And I did find a quote, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I was probably quoting Justo Gonzalez, who was quoting Robinson's Suitor.
That's right.
I believe that's what happened. So the quote, the quote, and I'm just going to read the quote. This is what I had quoted. Irritated at the obstinacy of the Donatists in declining even yet to accept their defeat, Constantine now enforced the decision of the councils by the aid of the secular arm. The Donatists were deprived of their churches, their property was confiscated, their bishops were exiled. When they still remained refractory, Constantine sent an army, and for the first time in the world's history, Christians slaughtered Christians. Fire and sword swept over the country. Such were the fruits of the alliance of church and state. So you feel that the statement specifically where he says, for the first time in the world's history, Christians slaughtered Christians, that is taking it a little too far, because if one of the Christians in that equation, there's supposed to be two sets of Christians, if one of the Christians in that equation is supposed to be Constantine, you're saying he wasn't even there. He didn't actually lead an army. If he's one of the Christians who was leading it, going to kill other Christians, because it doesn't really qualify that. It just says Christians slaughtered Christians. Am I supposed to assume that there were Christians in his army, or that he's the Christian who was killing other Christians?
Well, first of all, let me just say this. I looked up. First of all, Justo Gonzalez is unfortunately wrong, and I've found him wrong in two things now. I know. Reading your blog, he is not one of your favorite people. Well, he's not a historian. He's a theologian, and he really should stick to writing theology and not write history. just like I shouldn't try to write theology because I'm not a theologian. And he gets a lot of things wrong. He quotes Suter, and I went back and read Suter, and I found a review of Suter that was really interesting, that appeared in the Saturday Review, July 27th, 1907, page 114, 115, and here was the title of the review of his work that you quoted Gonzalez as quoting. The title of it was Half-Educated History, and I want to read a few of the quotes out of the review because it is exactly what I said about that quote. His pages have often the appearance of being a hasty transcript of notes from second-hand sources. The whole thing is certainly not the work of a thorough scholar. He seizes on great and important facts, but they often become worthless or even ludicrous from the hurried, slipshod fashion in which they are expressed. Then it says, these defects of workmanship, however, are less serious than the unhistorical spirit which vitiates many of the author's judgments. And then again, it makes another comment about not using original authority. And so Suter was criticized for not using primary source data. And that's my criticism of Gonzalez. He makes quotes from things. One of the quotes I found of Gonzalez was from a children's book about Roman women. I mean, come on. That's just ridiculous. In a college-level historical textbook, it's ridiculous. And when you make statements like Suter makes, you need to back it up with primary documentation. That's just good scholarship. And he doesn't do that. And so my complaint about that quote is the following. Number one, we don't know that the police force contained any Christians. We don't know that the governor was Christian. The fact that Constantine tells his governor to do something about the violence, that's Constantine being an emperor. I use the example on my website. During the Rodney King riots, the governor sent the National Guard in to get the peace in the streets of L.A. in the Watts riots. Some people died in that encounter. But I don't think I don't blame the governor for the deaths. I blame the people out rioting for the deaths that led to police action. Now, were Roman soldiers brutal? I mean, my guess is the Roman soldiers were very brutal when they killed those Donatists. They didn't have to kill them. I mean, that's Roman soldiers for you, unfortunately. Roman soldiers were known, if you made them fight, if you made them fight, they didn't take any prisoners. I mean, they let loose the dogs of war. That's where that saying comes from. Let loose the dogs of war. They literally had dogs that they would let loose on their enemy. That was the first thing they did, and the dogs would rip people apart. I mean, they didn't take prisoners. And so, but I guess my problem is it wasn't an army, it was a police action. The way Suter tells it, it sounds like all the Donatists were rounded up. It was only in Carthage, and it was only really in a couple of churches. They didn't even bother all the Donatists out in the other cities because those Donatists weren't out in the streets acting like idiots. You know, the circumcilian sect was out beating people.
I'm sorry. I want to agree a couple things, because I went and looked up a little bit of history about the Donatists, and I want to say they were insane. They were really, really crazy. I mean, from what I had read, a lot of these guys would on purpose try to get people to persecute them so that they could die as martyrs, and they would use sticks because Jesus commanded them not to use swords. So they wouldn't use swords, but they would hit people with sticks, hoping that people would kill them. It was really nuts. So I agree with that. They were kind of asking for it, and I think that's part of why they were so obstinate. It's almost like I would agree that you can make a case. They were probably looking for a fight. They probably wanted to be martyred.
But listen, that's not the first occurrence of that either. Christians in the 2nd century did that. Montanists did that. They begged Romans. There's a story of a Roman governor riding in his carriage, and he's in a hurry to get to his province, and his carriage gets stopped in the road, and he leans out the window and says, "What the heck's going on?" And one of the soldiers says, "There's a group of angry Christians out here." And he goes, "Well, get them out of the way." And they said they're not going to move until we take one of them captive. And the Roman procurator looks out the window and goes and commands them to get out of the way. And the Christians are yelling, "No, take me, kill me for Jesus. I want to be a martyr." And the Roman procurator just gets flustered and points at 3 or 4 and goes, "Okay, you, and you, take them away." And the soldiers grab them and start marching them off to execute them. And all the Christians are behind them, rejoicing for them and praying for them that they were going to be martyred. I mean, and that's the kind of history that I never heard as a young man when I was told about how terrible the Romans were. I mean, the Christians did stupid things, man.
Yes. Oh, no, and listen, and I agree with you, too. Like you said earlier, a lot of the things that are laid at Constantine's feet, things like hierarchy in the church, as an example. I mean, when I was reading through, I realized, oh my gosh, Cyprian was, I was shocked when I was reading some of the things that Cyprian did, and I thought, man, what he did to advance the idea of hierarchy in the church and the authority of the bishop was way worse than anything Constantine directly did.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to make the statement that Christian hierarchy was already in place. I mean, Christian hierarchy starts very early on. I mean, look, if you believe Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, it started right away. And Constantine liked it. Think about it. He's a Roman emperor. He's a believer in government and order and structure and administration. He liked the Christian hierarchy, and he encouraged it because he thought it was good. He thought it represented organizational structure, which he, by definition, he thought that was a good thing. And my point is to say, because he thought it was a good thing, doesn't make him a bad man. I mean, it doesn't make Cyprian a bad man. It doesn't make these guys not Christian because they believed in hierarchical structure. And I know you run a house church. The early church had buildings from way back. It wasn't an invention of Constantine. It wasn't even an invention of 3rd century. They had church buildings from early on. They started in houses, yes. They continued to meet in houses for a long, long time. But as churches got larger, they looked like anyone running an organizational structure is going to try to find a bigger and better location. Now, I'm a believer in home church, and I believe in dividing churches, the cell theory, that you grow it to a point and then you divide it and grow it again. But because the early church didn't take that model doesn't mean they weren't Christians. And I think that's my issue, is that we not label Constantine or any of these early Christians or early church people or whatever you want to call them, that we not label them pagan because they don't line up with our particular doctrinal litmus test. That's my point. And I know for you, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to make this last statement. I know for you, pacifism is a very important topic. And the only thing I would say about it is this. We have to be careful that we not see everything through the lens of our most precious dogma or doctrine, because then we end up judging people. I listened to one of your podcasts where you and another man, and I don't remember his name, were talking about how we needed to be towards homosexuals. And I agreed with what you guys are saying, but I found myself thinking, wow, I wish Keith would extend the same grace to Constantine that he wants everybody to extend to homosexuals. And I'm gonna close out because I know we're out of time.
Oh, well, that's great.
Thank you for having me.
Oh no, Al, I really appreciate you, and I, even though we don't agree on all this stuff, I really appreciate your spirit, and I really love talking to you. if you could, we should do this again sometime and continue the conversation. Yeah, I think it would be great.
We didn't get into any nuts and bolts, man.
I know, and actually, even like just you just now like touched on something like about hierarchy and the pastoral epistles and stuff. And see, that to me, I wouldn't agree about the pastoral epistles being evidence of any kind of a hierarchy. But that would be great to go into, so we could talk about that. Sure. And does it or does it not? That could be another topic. But I think, we could get into some nitty-gritty again on Constantine. Maybe we'll do a part 2 of Constantine and then do another one on either nonviolence or hierarchy in the church or that kind of thing.
Keith, I enjoyed it, and I appreciate you having me.
All right. God bless you, Al. Take care. Thanks for being on the show.
Sure.
Bye.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. So I want to thank Al for joining me on the show today. Thank you for listening. And again, if you have any questions, anything you wanted us to talk about that we didn't get a chance to, go ahead and send that to me, either email or comments on my blog or on Twitter or Facebook. I'd be happy to make sure that we discuss those things next time. Thank you for listening to Subversive Radio. God bless, and let the kingdom come.